Tighten up, leaders. Welcome to the Nuts and Bolts of Leadership, the show that drills into the foundations of what leadership is all about. I'm your producer and co-host, Hali Gibson.
And I'm your host, Billy Duren.
Join us as we sit down with leaders from across the country to mine for nuggets of wisdom.
All right, everyone, welcome into the meeting room. Today, we're going to be talking about leadership. This is the Nuts and Bolts of Leadership podcast, and I'm the host, Billy Duren. Joined in the meeting room with producer and co-host Hali Gibson. Hali, welcome to the meeting room.
Great to be here.
Hali, we just finished our 45th anniversary celebration. I'm tired. A little energy draw. We're going to pull from our guest today some energy. What were your quick takeaways from the 45th? You did a great job all together, but what were your quick takeaways from the 45th?
It really did feel like a family reunion, and that was something that our last guest on the show, Debbie Rogers, said she was looking forward to the family reunion, and it really did feel like that. I mean, it was seeing everybody who you don't really get to see all that often, and then bringing in not just our employees, but their spouses to hear about, we spend so much time at work, almost as much as we do at home. And so for our spouses to be able to see, what we're doing every day was really cool to me.
It was a great night, and looking forward to the next 45 years. So, Hali, today we've got a seasoned veteran. I'm talking about, this is like, I actually wrote in my notes, the Tom Brady of experts on leadership. Daniel Goldstein is with us today. Daniel is the former CEO of Folience company. Daniel Goldstein has been part of the ESOP community and a champion for employee ownership for years. And I'm so excited to hear from him today as we explore employee ownership and the other things that he's doing now. But Daniel, welcome to the Leadership Podcast.
Thank you. It's great to be here, and happy anniversary. It's hard to believe that you were both there on day one, 45 years ago.
That's good. We talked about Hali and I's story. We talked about how her perspective and my perspective, because I have been with the company such a long time, and she came in 6 years ago.
7 years ago.
7 years ago, and her perspective and my perspective on how we started with the company is so different. But our CFO likes to say that I haven't worked for one company all those years. I've worked for several companies as the company has evolved and grown over the years. So it's been interesting. So Daniel, so many things on your resume and your bio that I just was kind of picking apart and love reading your story. You've advised so many companies, so many families in converting in their business, transitioning ownership in their businesses. Just before we get started into the details, did you find those stories and more similar or more different when you were talking to families that were transitioning or owners that were looking for the next phase of their career? More similar or more different?
So as they say, when you've met one family business, you've met one family business. And same thing with ESOP. And then, yes, of course, there are great commonalities and we can learn from each other and best practices. But I'm a self-proclaimed company geek. I just love seeing how companies are built, how work is done, and the different voice and style of management in each one. So there are lessons to be learned, certainly, and shared. And that's one of the great things about the collaborative nature of the ESOP community. And it's always pretty much a unique situation that you walk into.
So, Daniel, I'm going to get you to tell me the story about how Folience began. But before that, I'd like to know what it sounds like when you hear now former CEO and retired CEO. Is that resonating? Is it hitting home yet that you're hearing that?
It's wonderful. So I can now sport my pink flamingos without having any repercussions from it. It really is. It goes down in all seriousness to a couple of things. Two most important being motivation and identity. So the first motivation, the motive for being in the role of president CEO is to serve the employees, the employee owners, and the ESOP. And so it should never really be a problem when you move on from that. And then just personal identity. Certainly there's my dynamic duo business partner, my executive vice president, would always remind me that I had CEO tattooed across my forehead, and I could never forget that, no matter how approachable and humble I might want to be in talking with employee owners. But that's also not my identity. And so much more so is just the purpose of continuing on advocating for employee ownership and seeing great firms like yours succeed and where possible, helping them succeed. So I'm very comfortable with it.
Well, I'm excited to hear that because before we get off today, I want to hear about that transition and preparing for that, because I know that there are people listening that are considering what's the next chapter in their journey. You're talking to one of those people, but there are other people that are listening that possibly selling their company and moving on, handing off, even considering employee ownership as part of their exit strategy. So we will get to that at the end of the program today. But Daniel, when I first heard you speak, we were at Pittsburgh, I believe, as the NCO conference up there, and you were talking about your role in helping a family business transition from being a TV station into buying an ambulance manufacturing company. And I was writing in my notes, I was thinking about the Top Gun movie when Tom Cruise tells Goose in the back, we're going to slow down and let them fly right by. And Goose's famous words were, you're going to do what? And I'm thinking that there must have been some similar reaction when you said to the family, we're buying an ambulance manufacturing company. We're a television company, but we're going to buy an ambulance manufacturer. Tell our audience about how that went.
And my image, Billy, might be more probably from something like one of those hospital shows where you have to give a shock to the system to bring them back alive. So it's and just for the context, the family had transitioned first to partial ESOP in 1986, then to 100% ESOP in 2012. And when I came in, it's because they had actually just sold their television station. So they're back to being primarily a newspaper and primarily print-based revenues. And that was not going to be the way to go forward to the next 130 years because they had started with the newspaper in 1883. So I was brought in to take what was remaining on the balance sheet and redeploy that to acquire revenue that would create new profitability. And so why an ambulance company? It was opportunistic. There was this great ambulance manufacturing company in a very small rural town of 180 employees in a town of 2,100 in rural Iowa. The widow of the founder was 75 when I met her, didn't have heirs to pass the company to, and didn't want to sell to private equity or a strategic buyer because she was afraid they'd move it out of the community, and that'd just be devastating to not just the community, to the surrounding county or a number of communities. And so it was very opportunistic that here was an employee-owned company that wanted to invest in employees and a brand in a community, and they were looking for a succession path. And that's one of the great stories about ESOPs, that it does provide that succession where family-owned businesses, I've worked with family-owned businesses for 2 decades before I came into the employee-owned field. The problem with family-owned businesses is that they often rely on DNA for succession. And ESOP companies, especially when deliberate thought is put into succession systems, don't have that issue.
So when we talk about differences between apples and oranges, I often talk about greater contrast between apples and Toyotas. This contrast was huge. So when you consider what possibly could have come forward for the family, did you prepare them for that? That, hey, we're expanding our thought process here. We're not even going to be on the fruit aisle anymore. We're out here looking for investments that could be so contrasting. You may need the shock paddles. Were they prepared for that beforehand?
I'd say no, but there's another part to the story, Billy, which is that my predecessor had come up with the idea for doing a holding company, didn't leave me the plan book. And so then I just had to take that was the idea and come up with building the team and executing on the plan. But also it was right when I got there that the family really exited from, they had no longer been in management and they'd exited from the board. And so part of the reason was because they just would not have been relevant to that. When you talk about apples and Toyotas, if you buy a Toyota, probably the apple orchard farmer is not going to be much help in maintaining the Toyota. Or if you were buying an apple orchard, your Toyota mechanic wouldn't be very helpful in how to manage the apple orchard. And so it really was a matter of, it was a shock to the system. And we had to rebuild not just internally who are the relevant resources people, but starting with the board. And that went very well. The board has been fantastic, and they're still there today.
So the leadership team development was part of your coming in. So tell us a little bit about how you began to create that momentum toward building a new leadership model.
Well, it all started with a program at the University of Pennsylvania that was founded years ago by Ginny Vanderslice and has been facilitated by her ever since. They're getting ready for their next session in a couple weeks, and I could not have done this without having gone through that program. Most people know that program, I sent the president of our ambulance company, the president of our trailer company, my dynamic duo business partner, my EVP, and my successor. It was part of the contract in hiring him. We'll be going there in about 2 weeks. So the first step was, as they say on the airplane, put on your mask before you help others. And that's what that UPenn program is about. It's really helping you develop your own mindset, which is unique to leading in an ownership setting. So starting with that, and then working with developing a new leadership team, bringing them from a culture which really had been quite toxic and hadn't been very employee ownership friendly, to setting new expectations. We did not work on full open book management, but we did tend to greater transparency and inclusion of people who are closer to the work to bring them into that decision-making process. And as one can expect, there were some that did not make it through that process. Either they self-selected out or they self-selected out in another way, as in invited to not continue. But over time, just as we developed a great high-performing board, I'm just really proud of the leadership team that we built.
Well, I'll tell you this. I'm a student of the UPenn program. Matter of fact, Daniel spoke when I was at the program 2 years ago. He was one of the speakers there. Jenny has been on our podcast. I had a chance to do a presentation with Jenny in Atlanta a couple of months ago. It was what an honor to be on the same stage with Jenny. She is a dynamic leader, dynamic speaker, and that employee advocate, employee ownership advocate. That's incredible. And I loved my time there. With matter of fact, our UPenn group just got together 3 weeks ago in Dallas. We kind of had a reunion of sorts. We do continuous ed at least once a year. We get together, and then we meet at some of the ESOP events. So it is a great program, and I'm sure you would encourage the CEOs and up and coming CEOs to be a part of that program going forward. Haley has a question for us.
One of the things that Jenny talked about when she was on the podcast was about succession planning. And like you said, the owner of the ambulance company didn't have a clear out. She didn't have a clear succession plan when it came to passing her business on. And she also had the heart to not want to sell to private equity. And we're seeing that a lot, is that a lot of companies, a lot of owners have the heart to serve their employees and they don't want to sell to private equity. I actually just finished a Freakonomics podcast called Should Companies Be Owned by Their Workers? And it discussed private equity and employee ownership. It seems like a David and Goliath-like contest where private equity has this massive footprint and employee ownership is a rather unknown idea in many areas. So how does education on employee ownership play a big part in changing this narrative?
Yeah, absolutely. And there are so many ways I could go with that, Haley, on the succession planning, on how a company transitions to employee ownership, on the spectrum of different company ownership and why that private equity model, I believe, is very relevant to making sure that employees across the entire spectrum of company ownership are getting the advantage of that transfer of wealth to employees. But the leadership, the succession planning, I'll give another example of when we acquired Cimarron Trailers. There's actually a New York Times article that reports on that transaction and talks about how the founders, Michael and Lynn Terry, really wanted to convert their company to employee ownership, but they were concerned that if they made a standalone ESOP, then Ben, who's now a great president, that he and his team would be distracted by not being able to put all their focus on running the business as they navigated learning how to run an ESOP, because it's really two different core competencies. It's operational versus compliance. And so they really liked that succession model of joining the holding company structure. Folience did not in any way invent it, and there are more and more companies that are identifying as holding companies because there's so much acquisition and because that is a great succession plan. So I'm not sure if I answered your question, Haley.
You did. I think that it was an interesting podcast. My mother-in-law actually sent it to me, and it was kind of like this story about how private equity is this huge kind of monster idea that's happening. But in my knowledge of you, even before we came onto the podcast, I was like, well, Daniel's kind of doing the private equity version of ESOPs, and that's just so unique.
And Haley, I will go for a second into that because I have met with Pete Stavros, and he's been a student of employee ownership since he was a college student when he first reached out and met Corey Rosen and showed that he really is truly interested in employee ownership. It's a very different model, but I'll tell you that recently I was at a pretty important conference for private equity. You know, everyone's going, ooh, what's he doing there? Well, it's to get outside the tent and see what's going on. And what's really evident is that across the country, every state has pension funds, which are usually in the billions of dollars. And then there are sovereign wealth funds, there are family offices and ultra high net worth individuals and foundations that are investing. They're going to continue investing in private equity. So can private equity do better and all that? Absolutely. But if what Pete Stavros is doing is not encouraged, then there's going to be a huge sector of the economy that those employees don't get the benefits of that wealth transfer. And just as it's the 50th anniversary of ESOPs, 50 years ago, what Kelso first ideated as an ESOP has morphed quite a bit. And so already what Pete Stavros is doing is morphing that Chicago Overhead Doors, when it was sold, the buyer is putting in a similar plan. And so I think that it's not an either or situation. Mm-hmm. And yes, we need to keep track of how these go and also differentiate that is not the same as the ERISA ESOP like yours and the one that I was president and CEO of. But it's important to make sure that those employees get a transfer of wealth as well.
I appreciate you saying that you are willing to go outside the tent. That's a really nice phrase in that sometimes we put our head down. It's one way, it's only one way, and we miss so many opportunities when we get into those blinders on type of mentality. I want to go back just a second though. I'm getting completely off my script here. You said something earlier that really resonated with me because some of the challenges, and I can tell you that the first time I heard about employee ownership, ESOP 101 looks nothing like ESOP 404 now that we are a mature ESOP, and now all the dynamics of governance and compliance and the things that come along with that. You know, the first version of it is this great happy thing, and everybody just gets, paid for not any contribution of their own money, but there's just this big, prize at the end of the rainbow. But the truth is there are these competing, I'm not sure what the competencies, I think is what you said, competing competencies of operational and governance at times. And there seems to be at times a little tension between those things because we sometimes feel like we're really good at running the company, but then this ESOP thing gets in the way when we have all these compliance issues we got to make sure we're doing. So Daniel, how have you helped companies kind of thread the needle, so to speak, in finding the balance between a great, because that's one of our strategic anchors is operational excellence. We want to be a great operational, efficient machine when it comes to running this organization, but we want to have compliance excellence as well. And how did you thread the needle with those companies, helping them make that transition in their corporate mindset?
Yeah, and this time I took some notes so I can make sure they do answer the question. So the first thing, something that my employee owners taught me is that I used to talk about how the ESOP shares were free. And they said, we worked hard for that. So I learned to say that they're earned. You don't pay for them, but they're earned. So I just wanted to get that in. So one of to answer your question, Billy, I think that I was fortunate in that I did not grow up in the ESOP community. And let me explain why. When I first came into the ESOP community, I was struck by two things. One, this collaborative, generative, energy and just willingness to work together and camaraderie and all that, which was great. And also, but these are businesses and people didn't talk about them all the time as if they're businesses. And so I recently wrote something which the NCO published, and the title of it was Beyond Rainbows and Unicorns, the Case for Considering ESOPs as Businesses. And the reason why I wrote that is because in the first 2 years, the company that I took over was doing very poorly financially. And cumulatively, in the first 2 years, our share price dropped 50%. And that was really tough because people weren't talking about that in the ESOP community. And I know that others have had that or will have that. And so in Tampa, Kevin Bird from Shepherd Exhibition Services in Atlanta, CEO of that great ESOP, and I got up and talked about this. I think what people need to realize is that there are life cycles. There are business life cycles with cyclicality, seasonality, recessions, inflation, all the things that affect other businesses. And yes, ESOPs have advantages because we're slower to lay off, we're quicker to rebound and all that. But to never forget that there is that cyclicality, that life cycle of the business. And then on top of that, something that you mentioned, there's the life cycle of the ESOP. Because a new ESOP is very different from sort of the midterm ESOP. Then you get into mature and looking at sustainability studies and are you done with your internal loans? And then you've got the silver tsunami, which is not just transition of businesses, it's transition of employees. And so you get this big bubble of employees, which is a big bubble of shares that's going to drop off. And are you going to recycle, redeem, releverage, all the different R's? So it's really looking at the life cycle of both the business and the ESOP. And what's great is that ESOPs that were set up decades ago probably didn't have the advantage of what ESOPs that are being set up today have. And so just recently, I had the great fortune to get involved with one of the newest ESOPs from this year. It's in Youngstown, Ohio, called M7 Technologies. And Mike Garvey, who transitioned from his ownership to 100% employee ownership, just wants to do the right thing. And it's so much fun because in 2 board meetings, we've gotten more governance and good practice into this brand new ESOP than some ESOPs I've seen that have been around for years. And that's what's really impressive, that we can learn from all those who had to slog through sort of the old models to get to where we are today. And the new ones, if they really just adopt the best practices from the get-go, they're going to be at such an advantage.
Well, I think that we are into ESOP 404 discussion right now, and I'm so appreciative of it. So when we come back, we're going to talk to Daniel about his trips abroad to talk about employee ownership. I talked to Christy Mark about how do I get involved in that, Daniel, and she just kept saying that I need to get closer to Daniel Goldstein. So here you are on the podcast. We're going to find out how we get to the European version of employee ownership. So when we come back, we'll talk about Daniel's trip abroad and also talk about his leadership style. So we'll be right back. This is the Nuts and Bolts of Leadership podcast.
Threaded Fasteners is a 100% employee-owned company whose mission is to create value in and for the people we serve. So, if you're interested in learning more about how we develop a people-centric culture, or if you're interested in a customized fastener solution, send us an email at culture@threadedfasteners.com. That's culture@threadedfasteners.com.
All right, everyone, welcome back to the podcast, and we're with Daniel Goldstein. Daniel is the former and retired CEO of Folience and Haley. He's dropping some serious nuggets on us already today. Daniel, I know that your involvement with the ESOP Association has afforded you some opportunities to go over to Europe, I think in London, maybe. I'm not sure where you were, but tell me about how this is developing as a partnership with the UK companies that are considering employee ownership models.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, to give a little bit of personal history, Billy, I actually lived for 15 years in Italy, based out of Italy, where I ran a family office and took care of their family businesses across Europe and the U.S. I'm actually just first generation American. And so I started developing my international contacts. The UK is probably the most successful and just explosive fertile ground for employee ownership outside the U.S., although hopefully Canada and others are quickly going to catch up. And then I had the great opportunity to go to the Oxford Symposium in August of 2023 with the ESOP Association delegation. And there are 20 or 21 countries represented there. What's really interesting is to see, again, similarities and differences. Similarities, employee ownership works across all cultures and different governmental regimes, regulations. Campbell MacDonald, the executive director of Ownership at Work, a UK-based think tank, just last year released some great research that basically shows that the similar benefits to employee ownership, even under a different system, different culture, are pretty analogous to what we've seen in the US. The differences are that ESOPs are regulated by ERISA under the US tax system. And obviously, those systems are different around the world. So the prevalent form in the UK and now growing in Canada is the EOT, the Employee Ownership Trust. Very different and wonderful in how it gets wealth to employees. The ESOP, you get to hold for your benefit shares, which have capital appreciation, and you get that benefit when you leave the company. The employee ownership trust, I'm not an expert on it, but it's much more of an annual payout of a share of profits rather than having the capital appreciation. Again, there's not that there's something better or worse. There's a spectrum that goes from co-ops, ESOPs, employee ownership trusts, the profit sharing, other systems. And the reason why you have those spectrums is because there are different governments, there are different government regimes, tax systems, there are different situations. Even the difference that usually people point to between co-ops and ESOPs, there's differences in company size and profitability and all that. What's really encouraging is that there is that momentum to grow employee ownership overseas.
So, Daniel, what is the mechanism? What do you plug into to communicate that? There's just not an ESOP hotline over in the UK. What is the connection to have a platform to talk and discuss this matter?
So there are different platforms. One is that there is a growing network of employee ownership, non-governmental organizations, NGOs across the world. And fortunately, one of the great things about the internet is establishing virtual communities. So there's that. There is this Oxford Symposium, which for several years has been bringing different representatives from around the world together. And there's just individual collaboration, there's research. Rutgers, the Institute for the Study of Employee Ownership and Profit Sharing, has been doing research for years, bringing fellows from around the world to share their research. And again, that gives that commonality and the differences of how employee ownership is being manifested in the benefits or challenges across those different countries. What is universal is that if you can get more wealth to employees, then that's better for the employees, their families, their communities, and securing a financial future. And that's absolutely the same across any country. So even I saw the other day that what Pete Stavros is doing, he just instituted that with a company overseas. And so the more that happens across all the spectrum of employee ownership, the better our society is going to be addressing the income and wealth inequality gaps across different countries.
So, Daniel, does it help or hurt when companies have an affiliation or even a satellite operation that are maybe based here in the U.S. and then they have an arm in the U.K., maybe manufacturing in the U.K. or distribution in the U.K., where you are an employee-owned company over here? And how does that affect the culture when you talk about ownership over in the U.S. and we're owners and we earn our shares? Is it a synthetic program that's set up for the employees in the UK that sort of tracks with the shares, or how do they skin that cat, so to speak?
Seen one ESOP with foreign affiliations. You've seen one ESOP with foreign affiliations, Bill. However, I will say that if you want to look at some of the really innovative best solutions that are being put in place, look to companies like Chemonics, Keras, Reels, Windings, and others, where they have affiliates in other countries. Chemonics, I think, operates in something like 90 countries. And In some of those countries, they can put together synthetic programs that look like the ESOP. In other countries, I think they find other innovative ways, whether it's profit sharing or other. There are tax considerations. You certainly don't want to disadvantage your employees in any way. And I'm sure that there are some that just haven't addressed that, even though they have the foreign affiliations. There are some very good ways to do that. And the truth is that that's really addressing the financial side. The cultural side, you could do that even if you weren't employee owned. I mean, let's face it, any company could be better to their employees and could get them more engaged, more involved, and make it a safer, more productive workplace with greater job satisfaction. Of course, when you have the financial lever, it makes it a lot more meaningful. But there are some really innovative ESOPs that are addressing that right now.
Well, that is a subject that we probably should bring you back and have the entire podcast on how we accomplish that and communicate that, promote that. Because I know that there are companies that have employee ownership here in the U.S. and the challenge of how they bring that in from the financial lever, as you just explained, how they bring that component into the culture. So Daniel, to pivot a little bit to more personal, your leadership style. One of the things I read in your bio is you have this collaborative participation. This is kind of how you think about how teams operate. Tell me how you encourage that sort of engagement when you were with Folience, but also as you were sitting on boards and helping direct employee engagement at the companies you're serving now.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, a little bit of personal context. When I was growing up, from a very, very young age, I grew up in upstate New York, and I would spend my summers at summer camps in the Adirondacks. And these were summer camps where there was no electricity, running water. You were taught to both learn better self-reliance, respect for the natural world around you, but also community and how to work together. And that's been foundational in everything that I've done. My first company, when I was 18 years old, I had 23 employees and had a house painting business, and really probably learned more doing that than when I went and did my MBA. So at Folience, elsewhere, it's about having what I call distributed leadership, which means that you don't have unilateral decision making. You don't have people that just hold the information, the power close to the chest. Again, not full open book management, but tends towards that transparency and greater inclusion of people closer to the work. It's also putting in some expectations. And I will point back to a moment that Ginny once challenged me and said, so when are you going to put in some expectations? And early on, as a neophyte, I was like, but it's employee ownership. Everyone will embrace it. And then I learned, no, you do need to have non-negotiable expectations. And they're pretty simple: distributed leadership, accountability, that you can't just be a bench warmer. You have to participate, but you have to be open with your participation. I had a graphic, which, and I wonder if it's still hanging in the conference room, and I left there, and the entire time I was there, it's a round table with chairs around it. And the whole point of it is that I love round tables because nobody's at the head of the table, and everyone gets a seat at the table, and anything gets put on the table. It doesn't matter how difficult, because otherwise it's going to be talked about away from the table. And once you have everyone participate and you have the different opinions and viewpoints brought in, when a decision is made, you need to leave with consensus, because employee owners, they want to have a clear vision of where they're going. So the other thing is, quite frankly, just I always said that I was appointed by the board, I reported to the board, but I worked for the employee owners. And that doesn't mean that they get to tell me what to do. It means that I never forget that that was what my purpose was. And even as a board member now, I let the other board members and the CEOs of the ESOPs I serve on boards know that I'm there to serve their employee owners. And my greatest motivation and commitment is to the integrity of the governance and serving the plan and the employee owners.
Well, I will say this: the first time we met, I think I've met you some different places over the years, but we had a conversation a couple of months ago, and one thing I remember that you said, and I hope I get this right, you wanted everyone to feel welcomed, respected, and heard. Did I get that right? So that meant something really special to me. First of all, that you just ripped them off. So that means that you have a very intentional consideration how you want your employees to feel. So we talk about behavioral standards at our company, and we want to talk about how we should behave, but I've never considered how we want them to feel based on that behavior. And when you pull that out, I just wrote it down as quickly as you said it. And I've hung on to that because it really did help sort of check another box for me. We can set behavior standards how we want people to act, but how am I considering how they feel when they're a part of this organization? Welcomed, heard, and respected, checked a big box for me. So that was really big.
And I did not make that up, Billy. I take no credit for that whatsoever. One of my favorite movie lines is from The Heist, and Gene Hackman's character says something, and this guy says, "How did you come up with that? That's brilliant." And he says something like, "I'm really not that smart. So you know what I do? I think about somebody smarter than me. I think, what would they do? And that's what I do."
That's pretty good. That's pretty good stuff. Haley?
I can tell, based on our conversations, why Folience was awarded the 2022 National Employee-Owned Company of the Year. Can you speak a little bit about why or what makes Folience a great place to work?
Absolutely. And the first thing that I'll say, Haley, is that we were so thrilled and humbled and honored. And the first thing that I ever tell anyone is that if we could get that, anyone can, and just call my successor or my team, and they will tell you anything that you need to know. And that's what's great about the collaboration in the ESOP world. I think what it was just very deliberately building a culture in which people were welcome, respected, and heard. And it takes time because in the beginning, people are very distrustful of that, especially because, like I said, we came from a pretty toxic beginning that I had walked into. But over time, with consistency and patience, you get there. I suppose that I can't get on any podcast or anything without showing this. Hopefully will show up. Yes, the basis for the culture behind Folience, and I do not speak for Folience, but I have been ordained as a lifelong caring member of this. This is something that I developed with the team, and it's the basis for the culture of Folience. And the whole basis for this is that you want every employee owner to remember they are an owner. What would an owner do? So I have this fun little thing that when I go into companies and they've got a list of words or phrases on the wall, I ask the CEO to turn their back and I say, okay, what's on the wall? And they can usually get 75 to 80%, but they can't get 100% because it's too complicated. I just want people to say, I'm an employee owner. What would an owner do? And once you make that real and meaningful, they're listened to, that's when the culture changes.
And because we're on the podcast and not the TV, you're holding up a card that says "License to Act." When we're seeing these things visually, probably when we go back to the UPenn experience for me, we were the same way. We had all the big words. We had integrity, and we had genuineness and humility, all these big words, but we had a cool experience with a table group, and we boiled down humble, hungry, aware. Those are our core values, and those are the things that anyone in our company, they'll spit them out for you because we're very intentional in communicating that. So I appreciate that. And I would say that was one of the huge takeaways for me in the CEO training. And again, I would encourage anyone listening in that line of succession or already in the CEO spot, get in touch with Jenny Vanderslice and be a part of that UPenn training. Daniel, we're kind of running up against the clock here, and I know we want to be a good steward of your time. We ask a lot of the same questions to the leaders that come, so we can allow you to speak directly to some of the emerging leaders that are listening. If we had someone in the room today with us, and you could speak to them directly about how do they begin their leadership journey, what would be your advice to them?
Again, I'll go back to developing yourself, because you need to really know who you are, develop that in order to then develop the space around you. The UPenn program is a great resource. One of the things that we did at the program is write our own personal mission statement. I have not deviated from the one that I wrote. Mine was pretty short. Do no harm, leave no footprints, make a lasting impact. And I've lived everything that I've done since then by that. I'll share a quick story. When I was going through my MBA program 30 something years ago, we had this president of some large multinational come to speak to students. We were getting ready to graduate. Somebody asked in the Q&A, what advice do you have for us? And we expected, resumes, networking, internships. And he said, learn a musical instrument, get psychoanalyzed. Everyone went, what? And he said, learn a musical instrument will do nothing for your career, but will broaden your horizons. I have not yet done that. I dropped out of blues harmonica class a couple of years ago. I still need to do the musical instrument. But the psychoanalysis, it's all about knowing who you are. And that's part of what the UPenn program does. But if you're not going to do the UPenn program, either with a counselor, with reflection, go on a hike, find time to meditate, you really need to get to the authentic motivations of who you are, why you're doing this. There's a great book, I think it's called Motive, which people should read. If you're not doing it for the right reason, then at least don't do it for an employee-owned company. Do it for someone else.
That's right. And it is the motive. It's Patrick Lencioni is the motive.
Yeah, great book. It all comes from that authentic connection. If you don't have that, pretty much everything else you do is just going to be superficial. And I'm not new agey. I don't sit around and sing Kumbaya. I think that is hard and not soft stuff.
I think part of getting to who you are, another one of those UPenn exercises that Jenny gave us was the tribute, the writing the tribute at the very last thing, writing a tribute to yourself through the eyes of someone else. My first hearing of that, I completely rejected it. I'm not doing that. That goes against everything I believe in. I was actually gathering cohorts we were just going to rebel. I just was not going to do it. But the truth is, after a few days, when I began to see my life through the eyes of other people, it was profound. It was profound to sit down and put a pen to that and the emotions that come with that part of that finding out who you are. Those type of exercises are incredibly freeing. They're incredibly self-identifying, all of those things that come with that. And I know that sounds a little touchy-feely, but quite frankly, finding out who we are allows us to lead from a genuine and authentic self. I can't be Daniel Goldstein. I can only be Billy Duren. I can't expect Haley to lead exactly the way I do. We don't need another Billy. We need Haley to be the best version of who she is and finding out those things. And I appreciate you saying that. Daniel, there are so many other things that I really wanted to get into with you, and we're really running short of time. I just want you to briefly say this. There are a lot of people out there looking for the exit plan. They're looking for what's the next chapter. Just briefly, if you could share how you prepared for the next chapter of your life.
Yeah, absolutely. So two things. One, and going back to what you said, one of the most basic lessons, which has nothing to do with emotions, new agey stuff or whatever, is plan your work your plan. And so plan your life and then work to that plan. And so it was a lot of reflection about what I wanted to do and how I wanted to spend my time working through different issues with my wife as well about what we want to do with our time, and then making sure that I had that in place. What I didn't want to do was wake up on January 1st and go, okay, now what? And so part of it, quite frankly, overcommitted in my last year, so that when I woke up on January 1st, I went, poof, now I can just really do the part that I'm going to be doing in my next chapter. For me, luxury isn't a bigger house or a nicer car or something. It's being able to choose how I spend my time. And so what I'm doing right now is I serve on a number of ESOP boards. I now serve on the board of the NCO. I continue working on employee ownership advocacy. I'm a fellow at the Rutgers Institute for the study of employee ownership and profit sharing. I'm also a fellow at the Ownership at Work's UK-based think tank. Spend a lot of time talking with those with business owners who are ESOP curious, as I call it, to help them get the right information and resources so that they can go on and convert to employee ownership. What you do when you're in my situation, you need to become tax efficient. So you set up your own LLC. Now everybody thinks I'm a consultant. I am not. So I will put it right out there. I am not a consultant. I'm just trying to be tax efficient with my non-reimbursable business expenses. And I'm enjoying doing that. It's really fun to work with emerging leaders. and help them where possible, and even work with those that are going through or facing what you're saying, their own personal succession, and just give them some ideas of what has worked and what hasn't worked for me as they look to plan their own succession plan. So when you're ready, Billy, let me know so you make room for Haley.
Well, I'll tell you this. I can tell you the rich content that we've gotten today has been such a great opportunity for us, but also for the listeners. I think we have a very big listening audience of employee owners and employee CEOs, employee-owned CEOs and leadership. So I appreciate you, Daniel, coming on and spending time with us on the podcast today.
And Billy, I am not a consultant. So I will give a free hour to anyone. If you want to get in touch with me, my LLC is Go ESOP LLC. And so it's simple, Go ESOP LLC at gmail.com. Happy to get you in touch with the people that then will be your consultants, but give you a half hour of my time.
There you go. And Daniel, thank you again, and we'll catch up with you soon.
Thanks, Haley. Thanks, Billy.
All right, everyone. What an awesome podcast episode with Daniel Goldstein. Haley, I'm not sure which one to pick. I've got nuggets all over the pages. I've got shares are earned. I've got luxury is how I spend my time. Plan your work your plan. CEO tattooed on the forehead of my life. I mean, good night. I was overwhelmed with all of the distributed leadership. Welcomed, heard, respected. Daniel is so richly connected to employee ownership. It was just a privilege to have him on. What did you take away?
He had his license to act, his card. He's a card carrying member the card that he had said a license to act. And I think that is something that it's giving all employees the license to say, you have the power, not only because you're an employee owner, but because you are an employee who's respected and you're an employee who's heard and you're an employee who's welcome.
And that act is the responsibility. We have a responsibility, not just the power to, we have a responsibility to see that things are doing right, not only doing them right, but seeing others are doing it right, encouraging the what do we call it? Operational excellence, that we want to encourage that all around us. Serving with intention, operational excellence, and
commit to serve.
Commit to serve. And that was our weekend, committing to serve. Impact on committing to serve. So, Haley, till we meet again, tighten up.
Tighten up.
Thank you for joining the Nuts and Bolts of Leadership podcast, brought to you by the employee owners of Threaded Fasteners. If you enjoyed our conversation, please subscribe to, rate, and review the Nuts and Bolts of Leadership wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Do you have a leadership story to tell or a question to ask? Email us at podcast@threadedfasteners.com. That's podcast@threadedfasteners.com. This show is made possible by our family at Threaded Fasteners, Inc. Our mission is to create value in and for the people we serve. Interested in learning more about TFI and how we create value in our team, in our communities, and in our customers? Visit threadedfasteners.com. Thank you again for listening. I'm your co-host and producer, Haley Gibson.
And I'm your host, Billy Duren.
This show is edited and produced by Johnny Glenn and our friends at Deep Fried Studios.